Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with tuba player Mike Forbes of the band Isthmus Brass. We talked to Mike in May 2020 about all things jazz and COVID-19 under the direction of brass icon John Stevens and comprised of the finest professional brass players in the Midwest. This band is Wisconsin's premier large brass ensemble. Mike opens up about it. Enjoy.
So, I guess this is a seminal moment at this point in our lives, like when 9/11 was when the airplane went to the tower. When did you kind of notice that things were changing, like mid-March? When did all the dominoes start falling down and you knew something was going on and live jazz was going to end?
That's a good question, actually. I mean, you're right. 9/11 was sort of like the world stood still there for the rest of that week. It happened on a Tuesday, and my goodness, by Friday, the world was completely upside down, and it stayed there, for a while. I felt like in some ways, the NFL coming back on a Sunday following that, where I felt like that really helped bring us back in some ways. The NFL kind of helped jolt us back into normalcy to some degree. And I don't know if we're going to have a moment like that in this instance. But for us, it really started, I think mid-March was kind of when New York kind of really started to get, hit hard and started locking everybody down there. It seemed like a lot of other states sort of followed suit and did it as well. That also aligned very nicely. I also teach at a university, and a lot of us in the group, the Isthmus Brass, are also educators. And we all have our spring breaks right around that time. So it sort of made sense from, a calendar perspective to have everything kind of come to a grinding halt there during spring break. And the initial thoughts were, hey, we're going to take a 2-week spring break, and we're going to come back and finish the semester. And boy, was that a misjudgment.
Well, and that's what everybody was thinking. They didn't think it would go this long, so it's not too far out of the realm. But talk to me about the band. How did this all form and start and kind of get to where we're at today?
Yeah, so the Isthmus Brass was formed in 2009. Myself I'm the tuba player in the group, and I was teaching at a university at that time with with my trumpet professor friend, a guy named Dave Cooper, who's a wonderful jazz musician here in the state. And he and I were just commuting together to work, and we were kind of dreaming up this idea. We liked the brass quintet, and we liked what the brass quintet had sort of come into. Obviously, look way back into the beginning of the brass quintet, and we were looking at New York brass quintet in the 1950s, and the American brass quintet showed after that. But it was really the Canadian brass that a lot of people still to this day would recognize as the, almost foremost brass quintet. And well, why was that? Well, it was because they were a crossover group, in my opinion. The American brass quintet, New York brass quintet, they played a lot of, they thought of themselves as like a string quartet. They played original music written for brass quintet. They played very serious works. Occasionally they would do transcriptions of ancient works like Gabriele and Renaissance pieces. That's where they were coming from, a real academic approach. Whereas Canadian brass was much more of a show, and they were about putting on sneakers and tuxedos and wearing, kind of somewhat funny clothes, and then portraying music that wasn't just classical, played at the very highest end, of course, but also then they'd break into sort of New Orleans jazz in a very classical kind of way. Admittedly, many jazzers kind of poo-pooed what they were doing, but what they were doing was just kind of delivering brass instruments as a crossover vehicle. Because the trumpet and the trombone exist in a symphony orchestra, but it also exists in a jazz band, it seemed like a great vehicle to kind of combine these two genres of music. So Dave and I always enjoyed that kind of brass quintet thing, whether it be, of course, later than that, there's this group called the Empire Brass, and then, of course, but nowadays it's the Boston Brass that are the great crossover brass quintets. But to Dave and I, we felt we were missing a lot of colors. One of the things that Dave and I, we both write some big band charts, Dave far more than I do, and one of the things that he loves about the big band is the fact that there's 4 trumpets and 4 trombones, of course 5 saxes, and a rhythm section. But it's those 4 trumpets and 4 trombones that give him the ability to write, 4-note chords in a section. And so this group, the Isthmus Brass, is made up of 4 trumpets, 4 trombones. I'm the tuba player, the bass player, essentially. There's a drummer, and then there's a horn player to kind of fill in sort of the mid-range voices and to cover the rest of the brass family. And so because of this, beefed up ensemble, it's literally twice the size of a brass quintet, we're given this opportunity to sort of explore a lot more colors and fill out much richer harmonies, especially when we play, more jazz-influenced tunes. So that was sort of, now this isn't an idea that Dave and I came up with, hey, let's let's bulk up this brass group. In fact, this type of group had been around since really the 1970s over in England. There was a group called the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble. And much like the Canadian brass, these guys were crossover musicians. A lot of them were London studio musicians who would be doing soundtracks one day and jazz gigs at night. And so that was sort of the background to this initial group called the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble, which eventually became the London Brass. And it was that group that really influenced us a lot, especially the London Brass. I have a number of friends in there, and they actually shared some repertoire with us, and that got us started. And again, what we really liked was, they would play, really interesting classical style music, stuff from the Renaissance, things like that. But then on the sort of second half of their albums, they would break loose and do some, much more jazz-oriented charts. I wouldn't say, really strong, hardcore jazz or anything like bebop or anything like that, but it was a start. Whereas Dave and I have really taken it with this group of the Isthmus Brass sort of to the next level. I literally just arranged Cherokee for us, and that was really a crowd favorite. It makes my life as a tuba player living hell, having to play these bass parts at lightning speed and trying to catch a breath every now and again. But it's really effective to capture the style and sound of bebop music and allows our jazzers in the group to really let loose in terms of their improvised solos, because these guys, unlike, I would say, the Canadian brass, who were sort of classical musicians who learned how to play jazz. In our group, we sort of have jazz musicians who try to play classical. No, I shouldn't say try, I shouldn't say that. Who really do play classical well, but their backgrounds are more jazz-oriented. And that's a little bit difference between our group and I'd say a lot of the other brass groups that are out there. So before I ramble on forever, this group got started in 2009 as a way, just to kind of put together a lot of my friends that I was gigging with, in different symphony orchestras or pits, in musicals in Milwaukee and Madison in particular. When Dave and I just kind of put our heads together and we came up with a dream team of folks we wanted to work with. And that personnel shifted a little bit over the years, but for the most part, we're still the same 10 folks. It's been a good ride for now 11 years.
What is it about the way you all communicate on stage and interact that has created this legacy that's gone on for so long?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of it is the fact that we did all sort of gig together. And as you know, in any kind of city, all the gigging musicians tend to hang out at bars after their shows are over with. And so there's already this camaraderie, and that camaraderie exists on stage, and I wish actually the audience could see our rehearsals, because you really see it even more there. The humor that sort of banters around the group as we kind of put pieces together and figure out, who's not, playing the style right, or who's not lining up the eighth notes together and this sort of thing. It's all said with a smile on our face, and with, the idea that everyone here is trying to put out the very best product that we can put out, and no one is trying to tell someone else how to play or how to act. There's no egos. We check the egos at the door, and everyone's really on the same page in terms of, hey, we want our group to sound the best, and if you think I'm playing these staccato eighth notes a little too short, let me know, and then we'll have an argument about whether or not they should be shorter or should be longer. But because everyone is sort of friends behind the scenes, we're already getting together to drink a beer after our shows, there's this camaraderie that allows us to have this very open and truthful conversation during rehearsals, which I think is great, because I know a lot of other folks in different groups, brass or whatever, jazz groups, symphony orchestra groups even, who, hey, I can't even talk to that person. I'm so angry with that person. There's people who won't even communicate because they just don't have that sort of that background, that friendship, perhaps. So I would say that's really been our recipe for success. And actually, when I talk with my students, when they're thinking about putting, groups together and stuff, one of the first things I tell them is like, make sure you're picking people you get along with. Make sure, you may love this way this guy plays the trumpet. He might be just a fantastic trumpeter. But if he's a jerk and you don't like working with that guy, my goodness, don't put him in your group, So the first rehearsal should probably happen at a pizza bar or something like that. Get a drink together and figure out what the vibe of the group's going to be, and figure out where you want to go with your direction, and before you start trying to figure out, who the best players are going to be. Now, that said, you want good players, but you want good players with great personalities.
Oh, I agree. Absolutely. So what would you say your main influences are as a band when you guys get together and you really kind of formulate what you guys have been influenced by? Who are some of the biggest jazz musicians that have influenced the way you guys are?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do, our very first concerts in 2009 started as Christmas concerts. And so we've all kind of gone through a whole bunch of different classical and jazz Christmas albums that we've all dug, and arrangements, that we found that seem to work, but if we translate them over. So right away, Mel Torme, and the classics, Frank Sinatra and those kinds of styles for sure. And also the arrangements. We've got a lot of tunes that do a lot of George Roberts bass trombone type stuff. That happens to be, of course, a big hero for our bass trombonist, Mark Holscher, who tries to emulate his sound and his presence. J.J. Johnson, of course, is very present in our trombone solos, especially from Tim Albright, who's kind of our lead trombone guy. You can hear a lot of, I think, you can hear a lot of J.J. Johnson. I don't know if he'd feel that way, but that's what I hear. Chet Baker is another one, big influence in terms of the arranging. Our conductor, John Stevens, is an amazing, he's a tuba player also, but it's an amazing jazz pianist as well. And he writes ballads and arrangements all the time for brass groups primarily. And I hear a lot of Chet Baker in his writing. And I'd say there's a lot of Miles Davis influence in terms of sort of thinking outside the box. The guy Dave Cooper I was talking about just did a big program at this SIM, the SIM School in New York, School of Improvisation, Jazz Improvisation, and he's really influenced by a lot of free jazz and that kind of ways of thinking about creating music, and just that sort of communication that happens on stage in the solos, in the improv aspect of things, which is something that is maybe a little more foreign to some of us more classical guys in the group. But that influence from Miles, I think, who started really a lot of his intrigue into that way of improvising and that kind of communication, really starts with some of those names, I would say.
So, we're going to get back to live music, and when we do, what revelations do you hope both the musicians and the crowd realize during this absence of live music?
Man, that's been on everyone's mind here lately, including my own.
Yeah.
I'm in a situation as well where I do teach at the university, but it's adjunct, so it's not a whole lot of money. Like most freelance musicians, we couple together a whole bunch of different things in order to make ends meet. So, obviously the playing, the symphony orchestra stuff, the Broadway play, pit stuff, once that comes back, I hate to say that we're all just looking at a paycheck, but right now, honestly, that's, I think, where most folks are looking. It's just, man, we got to pay rent. We got to get food on the table. So we need gigs. Even if it's as simple as things that, like, we all missed our Easter church gigs. That was a chunk of change that we all kind of depended on right around tax season to help pay those bills. And that didn't come, and luckily taxes aren't due till July 15th, but it's still, that death knell is coming. So financially, that's what I think a lot of musicians are looking at, just because we do so many different things to make ends meet. And I tell my students often, I'm sitting on like a three-legged stool. One leg is teaching, the other one's playing, and the third leg is I do a lot of composing and writing and managing of this brass group and some other things. And I feel like the teaching part is still there. I still teach private lessons, and I teach my university students through Zoom and Skype and FaceTime and all that sort of thing. So that leg of the stool is still there, but the other two legs are gone. They're just gone. So the stool has fallen over, and that's the challenge. So, I'm checking out, the unemployment monies for gig workers and things like that, and that's, we all are. And in Wisconsin anyway, none of that's even crept out yet. We haven't gotten any of that money yet. It's been 7 weeks in, 8 weeks in. So hopefully that stuff will come back. Now, in terms of, the audience, it's funny. I'm on Facebook and, watching social media and sort of things. And as we first got into this, you start to see a lot of folks who just are so accustomed to performing every day kind of missing that part of their life. So we're seeing a lot of online live Facebook performances. We're seeing a lot of people, myself included, getting on a cappella and trying to overdub themselves against themselves, playing duets, quartets, sextets, and that's a lot of fun. It's a great way to keep your chops going. I've really enjoyed trying to do that. And with a cappella, it's pretty rudimentary, app. You don't really you don't edit or anything. You literally just have to play it perfectly. So it's great practice to try to lay down these tracks. If it's a 6-track tune, with all the right notes the first time, we got to go back and do it a bunch of times so you get it right. Great work for the chops. And there's really an audience for that. Every time I post something like that on Facebook or YouTube, all my subscribers kind of go nuts. And there's not a financial gain, but except for people often will buy the chart that I played. So I do it for that reason as well, because I'm trying to publish these charts. And so a lot of times people will tune into that sort of stuff. So there is a desire, of course. And I found that really existed in March and into April. Starting to get to the mid part of April as now into May, I find that that's kind of dropped off a little bit. People aren't as interested. Maybe we over-flooded the market of live performances there for a bit. I feel like, I don't know, to me it just feels like it's tapered off and people are really starting to crave that sort of live experience again, and the computer just doesn't cut it, which is great, of course, and that's what we want to see. And I'm hoping in the summer especially, because there's so many outdoor venues where people can sit on a blanket 6 feet apart from one another. It can be outdoors, so we're not necessarily going to be contaminating one another. And the performers can be up on an amphitheater stage. I'm hoping that will be the venue that kind of explodes this summer more than any other. Of course, here in Milwaukee, we do Summerfest, which is a huge rock festival, as you probably heard of. Now, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if they've canceled it entirely or not. But I'm hoping things like that, so outdoor festivals, I hope will come creeping back in some way or another. But yeah, I don't know, man. I do not have a good feeling for live music coming back in a big way, like the NFL did for the 9/11 thing I was talking about. I feel like that was like, crack the thing open and here we go. I don't feel like that's going to happen this time. I think it's going to inch back, and I think there are some things that aren't going to come back. I feel really bad about that, but there are some things that are just going to be thin. Now, a group like the Isthmus Brass, we work based on concert series hiring us to come do concerts. And we had an okay calendar starting to come together for 2021, but that's all been put on hold, and rightly so. I mean, I don't think the people who sponsor these concerts aren't necessarily going to feel like their subscribers are going to commit. So that's the trouble for our group. But that said, our group has always been sort of a secondary thing for most of the musicians in the group. We all earn our bread either teaching or playing gigs and concerts with symphony orchestras and that sort of thing. And this thing is sort of an on-top type thing. We're not a group that gets out on the road and tours, 200 days a year or anything like that. So fortunately for us, it's not going to change our model very much. We're just going to kind of have to take a year off. We had a Japan tour planned here for November. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to be looking at now maybe November 2021 when we get over to Tokyo. And it's things like that. It's those kinds of tours that are great exposure for us, and hopefully we make connections and we can develop even further international tours. But all of that is going to be on hold, especially, internationally speaking, I think for a considerable long time, I'm sorry to say. I've listened to some of your other podcasts. It sounds like some of the other folks share that same concern. And, boy, we hope it comes back. But it's going to take a public that's got money in their wallet and willing to go and spend it on live music.
Yeah, I agree. Great insights, man. Mike, hey, thanks for talking about the band, this weird COVID-19 world and everything in between. I appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Wisconsin, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. Thanks to Mike for his time, music, and story. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino in the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.